too little too late. The scale of the coronavirus crisis is truly frightening in the United States. More than 300 million Americans are under some form of lockdown. Health officials are telling the public to avoid leaving their houses at all costs. Those measures seem to have come too late to stop the spread of the virus. US governors have appealed to the White House for a national strategy against the disease. But the richest country in the world seems to be woefully unprepared and structurally ill-equipped to deal with the crisis. President Trump, who had downplayed the threat for months, warns that there will be a lot of deaths in the coming weeks.
This will be probably the toughest week between this week and next week, and there'll be a lot of death, unfortunately, but a lot less death than if this wasn't done, but there will be death.
Anthony Fauci, the top American scientist battling the pandemic, has warned of a looming escalation.
Fortunately, if you look at the projection of the curves, of the kinetics of the curves, we're going to continue to see an escalation. Things are going to get bad, and we need to be prepared for that. It is going to be shocking to some. It certainly is really disturbing to see that, but that's what's going to happen before it turns around.
The U.S. Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, sounded an even more dire alarm.
The next week is going to be our Pearl Harbor moment. It's going to be our 9/11 moment. It's going to be the hardest moment for many Americans in their entire lives.
Has the U.S. got this under control?
We've got that way not only because of the Trump administration and the cutbacks they have made to vital services in the health area and the science area, but for decades we have had a medical system that is designed and organized to maximize the profit of the owners of the facilities and the owners of the healthcare practices, not to actually take care of patients. So when you have a situation like this where you have a large number of people who are desperately ill but without necessarily any means to pay for their treatment, our system really just does not have a way to deal with that.
The White House Coronavirus Task Force has painted a grim picture of where America could be heading over the next couple of months. The task force projects that even with mitigation, between 100,000 to 240,000 people could die from the virus. Citing data from the task force, President Trump claimed that as many as 2.2 million people would have died if we did nothing. He added that a staggering 100,000 American deaths would show that his administration has done a good job.
So you're talking about 2.2 million deaths, 2.2 million people from this. And so if we could hold that down, as we're saying, to 100,000, it's a horrible number. Maybe even less, but to 100,000. So we have between 100 and 200,000. We all together have done a very good job.
Trump made the grim assessment a month after he claimed the coronavirus would go away on its own. How would the US have reacted if leaders of other countries like Iran and China had warned of such death tolls in their countries?
We can see already, because we see what is going on with the U.S. in regard to China, another one of our designated enemies. So we have here, Trump calling it the China virus, the Wuhan virus, or the Kung flu even, and claiming that the Chinese have mishandled every aspect of this and that they didn't tell us how bad the outbreak was and yada, yada. But what is really the truth, of course, is that the Chinese government has done far better in handling this virus than the United States is doing.
Many hospitals across the US have already reached capacity, and new hotspots are springing up in every region. In New York City, the epicenter of the coronavirus in America, officials say the city may have to build temporary burial grounds in city parks to bury the dead.
The numbers continue to rise. We're talking now about burying COVID-19 victims in the New York City parks in mass graves. I mean, that's so, we have nothing to complain about other nations.
President Trump spent the crucial period in February and early March downplaying the threat, fearing the impact on the U.S. economy and his re-election.
Now, the virus that we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat. Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. People die from the flu, and this is very unusual. And it is a little bit different, but in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's a little bit tougher. But we have it so well under control. I mean, view this the same as the flu. When somebody sneezes, I try and bail out as much as possible. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
All the while, the virus was spreading in the country largely undetected, in part because of the government's denial and failure to provide adequate testing. It's good that Trump is finally acknowledging the magnitude of the problem, but it doesn't change the fact that the U.S. wasted 2 months that could have been used to bolster the federal stockpile of medical supplies and equipment.
Today is kind of getting worse and worse. We had to get a refrigerated truck to store the bodies of patients who are dying. We are right now scrambling to try to get a few additional ventilators or even CPAP machines. If we could get CPAP machines, we could free up ventilators for patients who need them.
A review of federal purchasing contracts by the Associated Press shows federal agencies waited until mid-March to begin placing orders of medical supplies and equipment. Will Trump be held accountable for his leadership failure during this crisis?
Should he be held accountable? Oh, yes, he should be. Will he be? I doubt it. I mean, there is no opposing force in the United States able to hold him accountable. The Democrats at this point are so compromised by their own corruption that, they aren't in any position to hold Trump accountable. A long-standing problem in the United States, and he's not the cause, but he has certainly made it worse through his shall we say, leadership. But I don't think that anyone is really going to hold him accountable.
Trump's culpability actually predates the virus's emergence in China. He eliminated a key American team working on identifying global health problems in China. He also shut down the White House's entire global health unit and proposed budget cuts for Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Department of Health and Human Services. As the administration was slashing the CDC budget, the U.S. military spending increased by $82 billion to $738 billion for 2020. The CDC budget, in contrast, languishes with only $11 billion, 1.5% of what the Pentagon receives.
Well, first off, the question is how many resources do we devote to protecting Americans? The CDC protects Americans. It works 24/7 to do that, and it can only do that if it gets the resources from Congress.
As Trump ignored warnings that the U.S. healthcare system was underfunded and in bad shape, his administration poured more money into the military to wage overseas wars. The U.S. is continuing to fight never-ending wars that have no military solution. It's operating 800 military bases all around the world at an estimated cost of $156 billion a year. Even as the country is battling the coronavirus, the U.S. military carried out another round of airstrikes in Iraq. Has the U.S. healthcare system been a victim of U.S. wars?
Well, of course. Yes, I think it has. I think all aspects of life in which ordinary people would like to be benefited by their government in some way have fallen victim to this militarism, to this imperialism, to this idiotic idea that we are the exceptional nation and that we should therefore run the entire world. And the amount of money we're spending on that is astronomical.
Late last month, Trump signed a $2.2 trillion bill into law, the largest ever in U.S. history, to protect the economy against the coronavirus fallout.
In this crisis, that the government has endless resources to spend to prop up the banks, to prop up the stock market, to prop up the hedge funds and the major corporations. They just have no funds to help the people.
Data show Black and Latino communities are being disproportionately affected by the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. In Louisiana, for instance, African Americans account for 70% of COVID-19 deaths, despite making up just 32% of the state population. Michigan and Illinois have also reported disproportionate statistics for Black communities. Experts say that's largely because higher percentages of Blacks and Latinos live in poverty and have more underlying health issues.
People who are in low-income communities, people who have underlying health conditions, hypertension, diabetes, renal failure, all of those things will help to accentuate their situation.
The world is only going through the early stages of what could become a series of crises that will take years to resolve. The first phase has been the healthcare crisis. The next will be the economic paralysis and possibly political turmoil. Trump dismisses the notion, but does that change anything?
Really on getting rid of this problem, this virus problem. Once we do that, everything else is going to fall into place, yes.
Experts predict a number of possible futures, depending on how governments and the society respond to the coronavirus crisis and its aftermath.
I expect after this virus crisis passes that we will go into a situation where we're going to have even further consolidation in the economy. Ordinary people are going to be destitute in far larger numbers than they are now. Everything will be ripe for some sort of collapse or some sort of revolution.
A global pandemic requires a global response. The crisis is unfolding at a time when global cooperation has effectively collapsed, thanks in part to President Trump's America First doctrine. Last month, the G7 summit ended in disarray simply because the US refused to sign any statement that did not link the coronavirus to China.
G7 members spent all of their time, but every one of the nations that was at that meeting this morning was deeply aware of the disinformation campaign that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in to try and deflect from what has really taken place here.
Cooperation between the US and China, the world's two largest economies, would be key to dealing with the pandemic and saving the global economy. But that relationship is in freefall. Meanwhile, the United States has cut financial aid to Afghanistan and Yemen, imposed more sanctions on Iran, and ended all support for the Palestinian Authority, including public health assistance. Has Trump's America First policy proven a dangerous fantasy?
And even in the response to this pandemic, what we're seeing is that the United States is doing nothing to help other nations, and in fact is trying to block aid to places like Iran and Venezuela and block aid from sources that it deems to be unacceptable, such as China and Cuba, while actually providing nothing on its own. And the nations that have come to the aid of others in the global community are Russia and China and Cuba. This is making it very clear, I think, to the world that the United States is not the nation you should be looking to for leadership.
Oil price war. The coronavirus pandemic has caused oil prices to drop to lowest levels in nearly 2 decades. Demands have declined as containment measures have shuttered industries, closed borders, and disrupted travel. But the greatest damage was unleashed in March after OPEC kingpin Saudi Arabia started an oil price war with Russia. Saudi Arabia began to flood the market before the extent of the damage from coronavirus lockdowns was fully known. With no market for gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, crude storage is quickly filling up on land and at sea. Riyadh and Moscow have engaged in a war of words, accusing each other of sparking the price war to hurt the U.S. oil sector.
I think that Saudi Arabia, Russia, they're negotiating, they're talking. I think I know what to do to solve it. But if they're unable to solve it, then I think I know what to do to solve it.
Or can you give us a glimpse
we
of
won't
what
mention it now, but it's tough. I think I know what to do to solve it. We don't want to lose our great oil companies. You know, we're the #1 producer of oil in the world.
What is the outlook for the global oil market?
Well, of course, I don't think that the global price war is primarily responsible for what's happening in the global economy now. Yes, before the coronavirus pandemic hit with its full force, there was a stock market crash that was partly precipitated by the oil price war and partly precipitated by the knowledge that the pandemic was about to hit or was starting to hit. Since then, of course, I think it's obvious that the consequences of the pandemic are much more severe than the oil price war.
While the low oil prices are bad news for the energy industry, analysts say they could boost consumers and non-energy sectors already rattled by coronavirus fears.
The oil price war is probably going to be beneficial for many sectors, those outside of the energy industries, because of course that means lower cost of gasoline and other products made from oil, and ordinarily that would be considered a stimulus. But on the other hand, that's something that we should be wary about, because in the long term, we have this thing called the global climate catastrophe that we also have to be concerned about. And there are many hidden costs of an economy that is relying primarily upon any kind of fossil fuels for its underlying energy supply and meeting its energy needs.
President Trump has threatened to impose stiff tariffs on Saudi Arabian oil supplies if Riyadh does not back down from the price war. Trump has also said that U.S. military aid to Riyadh could be on the line.
The oil price stays the way it is because of people that really want to see it go up. When I say we want to save a great industry, and we built a great industry in this country. If they don't get along, I would do that. Yeah, I would do tariffs, very substantial tariffs, because we're independent now. We have our own oil. And if I did the tariffs, we essentially would be saying we don't want foreign oil.
Since taking office, Trump has closely aligned his Middle East policy with Saudi Arabia, further emboldening Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Members of Congress have accused Riyadh of waging economic warfare on the United States and threatened a host of potential reprisals. Why is Saudi Arabia, which professes to be a U.S. ally, deliberately engaging in actions that threaten American interests?
Well, I think many experts have speculated with good reason that part of the strategy is to try to drive out the shale production in the United States by driving the price so low that they no longer can stay in business. I think there's another factor, though, the more obvious one is that after Saudi Arabia was unable to achieve an agreement with Russia and others outside of the OPEC circles, or what's sometimes called OPEC Plus, then because they didn't get what they want, then their second best choice, according to their calculus, was to just try to retain market share by driving the price even lower than it already was.
Nearly 50 House Republicans have signed a letter warning bin Salman that economic and military cooperation between Washington and Riyadh was at risk unless the kingdom moved to cut crude oil output. The letter cautioned that thousands of American workers in oil and natural gas fields face increased financial and economic uncertainty. Will the oil price war damage U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia?
Certainly, it's going to hurt. There are members of Congress making some noise, but unfortunately, that's a very, very long-term project. It will take quite a while before the fundamentals of that relationship are disturbed. I mean, the United States certainly has, if it's viewed rationally, has many reasons to abandon this relationship with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis' campaign in Yemen has been a complete human rights disaster. There was the whole Khashoggi affair from last year. There are a number of reasons.
Experts say the United States is probably as responsible as anyone for the ongoing oil price war. No country has flooded the market with oil as much as the United States has in recent years. Despite the collapse in global demand, US producers are still increasing output. That gives other major producers zero reason to swallow a financial hit on their own. The United States currently pumps about 13 million barrels a day, and no change is expected at least until the second half of the year. Is the United States also to blame for this?
Yeah, the United States has gone from being a net importer to a net exporter. It is there has been this huge boom from the use of hydraulic fracturing or fracking.
If anything, the historic drop in oil prices and Washington's inability to rein in an ally that's totally dependent on US aid for protection indicate that the notion of American energy dominance has always been a myth. The United States can pump record amounts of oil, but only if other big oil producers allow it to.
And certainly, the current Saudi strategy of flooding the market and bringing the price of oil way down is going to drive some of these shale producers out of partly for the reasons I already stated. It is mainly driven by speculation, but also that's clearly going to make it a losing proposition to continue to try to recover oil when prices are this low.